Hello everybody. It's a real pleasure and a privilege for the Institute of Historical Research, where I work across the way, to be working with Senate House Library on this event and to meet so many of Senate House Library friends. I'm going to introduce our speakers first of all, and then I'll say a little bit about how we're going to structure this event. I'm going to go round that way. So, first of all, we have Keith Gildart, who is Professor of Labour and Social History at the University of Wolverhampton. Next to Keith is Amy Todd, who has long worked as a public historian and is a doctoral student now at the University of Manchester and the People's History Museum. Next to Amy is Florence Sutcliffe-Braithwaite, who is Associate Professor of 20th-century British History at UCL. And next to me, we have Philip Murphy, who is Professor of British and Commonwealth History at the University of London and Director of History and Policy at the Institute of Historical Research. And of course, in the middle, we have Ron Heisler. Yes, this is what we want. This is what we want. We want a lively crowd tonight. Ron, I believe, looking on the internet, it says that you are a self-described delinquent historian. Is that still the case?
That's okay, yes.
Yeah?
Nothing wrong with delinquency.
Okay, we're going to start the evening with some delinquency and we'll see where we go. Of course, we are here to discuss the Heisler collection, to think more broadly about political archives, and particularly political archives of the left. The shape of this panel is going to, I'll act it out. Like that. We're going to start broad. We're going to start thinking about broader issues around political archiving, and with each speaker we're going to get closer towards the Heisler collection itself. There will be time, as Andrew said, for questions from you all, or just points that you want to make. So we'll try and make this as interactive as we can do. If at any point, particularly those of you who are at the back can't hear, please do just raise a hand, and we'll try and get the sound sorted out. Okay, so we're going to start. Each of the panelists are going to have about 5 minutes just to kind of say some stuff about their relationship to history of the left and with political archives. So that we're going to go around this way. Keith, over to you.
Do you want me to just sit here?
Yeah, if that's okay.
That's great, yeah. I've got the microphone. Yeah. What am I doing? Yeah. Hi, everyone. I haven't brought a PowerPoint or anything, so I'm just going to speak generally about my own work and my engagement with the archives. And I'd like to say a little bit about this idea of ground up, because I think it's really important in terms of my specialist field, which is labour history, but also recent work that I've done on the relationship between labour history, working class politics and popular music. I'm just setting a little timer here so I don't go on for too long. A big part of my own research has been on the Dictionary of Labour biography, which I have here. It's up to 15 volumes now. And the foundation of the dictionary is very much linked to political archives. The idea for the dictionary was created by G.D.H. Cole, late 1950s. And then the first edition of the dictionary was published in 1971. And the editor being John Savile, John Savile associated with the Marxist historians group. So throughout the history of the dictionary, it's drawn heavily on a whole range of archives, which has taken me across the country. And I think what's interesting as well is that the dictionary relied on labour archives and political archives being made available to researchers. So you will notice, if you take a look at the dictionary, particularly the early volumes, they draw heavily on the archives of district miners' unions, because a lot of those papers, the 19th century and through to the mid-20th century, were becoming available and they were being preserved. And I want to say a little bit more about coal mining history when I wrap up, because it's an important context in terms of how we use archives, how we curate them, and accessibility. The dictionary probably contains now over 1,000 entries on individual Labour figures. And one of the things I think that we need to discuss in the Q&A is the absences and the silences within archives, because that's something that we've tried to rectify in probably the last 5 volumes in the Dictionary of Labour Biography. In the early volumes, it's heavily focused on male trade union leaders, some of the big trade unions, and less so on radical organisations, on women, and on minorities. And these, I guess we call them esoteric traditions within the British Labour movement. And one of my other interests is the relationship between spiritualism, the supernatural, and the Labour movement. And I know you have the Harry Price collection here, which I've spent a lot of time in. So that's been my work generally on Labour biography and using archives. I've also used political archives to try and tell a different story about working class experiences. And that's took me into the world of popular music, fashion, and deindustrialisation, and the impact that that had on industrial communities. What's really interesting about that, and again, go back to this point about from the ground up, is that there's a lot of people now getting to a particular age who are really fascinated with history, and they're developing their own archival collections. So the last book that I worked on was a history of Northern soul music in the Midlands and the post-industrial Northwest. And because of the nature of that research, was looking at youth subcultures and popular music, it doesn't leave much traces within the historical record, particularly the experiences of people who are engaging with youth subcultures and popular culture. So that took me around the country, dinging about in garden sheds and in attics, just kind of accessing people's personal archives. So that's my kind of connection to popular music and its relationship to the political. The last thing I would mention, and I know that kind of Florence will touch on this as well, is the importance of coal mining history, particularly in post-coal societies. So obviously from the 1980s and into the 90s, coal industry went into rapid decline. Some of you might have noticed that across the country, there are local mining heritage groups. There's all kinds of commemoration for coal mining disasters and even commemorating individual collieries. In all those places, they're also building their own political archives. And again, I think this returns me to the point which is on the slide there about archives and political history from the ground up. Because within all these former mining communities, there's a rich array of primary sources, oral histories, and experiences. And there's a tension now, I think, between kind of conventional historical research and the kind of research and publication that's being done from within these communities. Similar connection with the work I was doing on the impact of soul music and the Northern soul subculture, because a lot of these people have now become historians and curators of their own archives. And where does that place us, really, when we're engaging with archives as historical researchers? And hopefully we can tease some of those tensions and problems out in the Q&A session. Bang on time.
Well done, Keith, and thank you. So that seems like a good place to move straight on to Florence, actually.
Thanks, Claire, and thanks, Keith. So like Keith, I've worked on various projects using archives of the left, but I'm going to mainly talk tonight about a project that I've just finished with Natalie Tomlinson, which focused on women's activism in the miners' strike of 1984 to 5. And there are sort of 3 different archives that we used in 3 different types of archive that we sort of used in different ways for the project. The first was kind of what you would most typically think of when you think of an archive held in a university library or a records centre. Papers were catalogued. Often there's quite a lot of ephemera in amongst the things like minute books that you might expect in a more kind of in the archive of a more organised institution. But those were the sorts of archives that we were used to using and we were comfortable with, we knew how they worked. The second kind of archive that we used or I should probably say kind of created over the course of the project, was our own archive of oral history interviews. And so for the project, we spoke to just over 100 women from coalfields all around the country, from down in Kent up to Scotland, South Wales, the Midlands. And we ultimately deposited almost all of those interviews at the National Coal Mining Museum for England near Wakefield, where a lot of them are already open for other researchers to use. So the second kind of archive that we were dealing with was this archive that we ourselves had created and were very intimately acquainted with. And then the third kind of archive that we ended up coming across over the course of the project was the archive of an individual woman who, when we went to interview her, sat down and said, "Oh, I've got this box out of the attic," which was always really exciting because you were opening it up and you just had no idea what you were going to find. And sometimes we had banners, sometimes occasionally there would be a kind of minute book, but that was quite rare. More often it was things like flyers, newspapers, newsletters, sometimes even an appointments diary showing what women were kind of doing from day to day and week to week as part of their activism in support of the strike. So that was the kind of archive that we didn't necessarily expect that we were going to find at the start of the project. And it was, in many ways, the most exciting because even though this was usually only one small box of papers, we really felt like we were at the coalface of historical research and looking at things that we hadn't expected to find. So that was, in some ways, the most kind of exciting. I think all of these types of archives, there's been lots written about all of them. And in some ways, we do have to approach more traditional archives and oral history archives differently. But I suppose when I was thinking about archiving the left, what I suppose I think unites the way that we need to approach these different archives as historians is, I suppose I find it interesting to think about the political commitments that led to these archives being created in the first place. And I suppose I sort of always want that to be part of the story and part of the analysis that we bring to the archive, thinking about the people who kept these things, whether it's, so one of the archives that we used extensively was the papers of Hal Francis, who some of you probably know of, really important figure in South Wales history and politics. And even during the strike, he had this sense, and it's noted in the incredibly extensive minute book of the organisation, the support group for mining families in Three Valleys. It's noted in the minute book that he has a sense that they need to record what they're doing for future historians, which is great. But I think it's also really important to think about the investments and the political commitments that led to women keeping this box of papers in their attic. And when we're approaching bodies of oral history interviews, to bear in mind and bring to the analysis a sense of what the political commitments were that led to those archives being created as well. So that was the thing that kind of struck me as important to bring together with all of these different forms of archive of the left.
Thank you so much, Florence. Philip, follow that.
Thank you. I'm gonna stand because I've got some images and I don't want to be craning my neck. What I want to do is for those of you who aren't familiar with it, convey to you very briefly quite what an exciting collection the Heisler collection is, and why it's so important for historians to have access to this. Sometimes as historians, you become a kind of prisoner of your subject matter. You focus in on a particular individual or subject, and you get stuck in that groove. And nowadays, that so much stuff has been digitized, and it's so easy to use online indexes. You can find what you're looking for very, very easily. But sometimes you just become blinkered, and you lose a sense of what's all the other stuff that's going on around you, around it. And what is often so rewarding in historical research is serendipity. That you know, the chance discovery that you weren't even, the unknown unknowns that you weren't looking for, and that transforms everything. And also the connections. The best history is about making connections. So to kind of, and Ron has assembled this fantastic collection, which you know, ranges over such a wide variety of different topics. And so what I did in just preparing for this evening was to really jump in almost at random on a particular class mark of the Heisler papers, which is MS 1226. And I can't even remember why. I think it was because there was a program of the American folk singer Phil Oakes.
Yes.
That was a sort of hero of mine. But so I kind of jumped in, and suddenly you get this excitement of you know, really being in discovering new things, making new connections, and stuff that you didn't even imagine really existed, and stuff that brings back memories. For me, I guess, of the late 70s, early 80s, when I was a teenager and becoming interested in politics. So just kick off. That there's so much wit in this collection. So there was something that I hadn't really even clocked. The print unions, during various disputes, this is the Wapping dispute with News International in 1986, did mock-ups of the Murdoch titles as sort of, you know, parodies. So that, you know, Rupert as a sort of page 3 pin-up, back page is Gary and Argy. Gary Lineker, of course, he'd just moved to Barcelona. It's undated, but that's how you know it's 1986. And that was kind of, you know, a lot of the parodies of The Sun focused in on the kind of the you know, the sort of jingoistic language it had used during the Falklands campaign, which was still pretty fresh in the memory. That's from a similar thing, but from an earlier dispute, union striking printers at the Times in the dispute in 1978-79, which temporarily ceased publication of the Times. And just something I caught my eye, win a holiday for 2 in beautiful Bulgaria. It's another sort of feature of, I suppose, the sort of left-wing subculture of the 70s and 80s. You read about it in Lexis Sale's memoirs, sort of travelling around with his dad in Eastern Europe on family holidays. From the kind of ridiculous to the sublime, some really beautiful things. The Liberator, 2 copies of The Liberator, this legendary US publication which ran between 1918 and 1924, edited by Max Eastman. So, you know, some of the finest artists in America produced material for it. It's really, really beautiful covers. But, you know, those of you who've seen the film Reds, John Reed, the American radical, reporting back on the Russian Revolution, wrote a lot of his stuff for The Liberator. You'll remember the sort of the arguments he has over, you know, how with Emma Goldman, over how the revolution is panning out. There's a piece by Emma Goldman on Trotsky in one of those issues, basically saying, I warned you. Close to Remembrance Day, people again of my generation will remember this. There was a large collection of photographs of Michael Foot from the time when he was Labour leader. This, of course, is very well known. It's the sort of cenotaph from 1981, so-called donkey jacket. Although, you know, he was adamant that it was actually not a donkey jacket, it was a very smart overcoat. And if you want to check it out, the iconic coat is in the Manchester People's History Museum as one of its prize exhibits. But actually, what sort of struck me was more this image. So some counter-protesters, as we've got used to calling them this weekend, from some kind of conservative group, maybe the Federation of Conservative Students, holding up banners at some meeting that Foot spoke at, called the Guilty Men, which of course is sort of making a link back to that famous book in 1940, which Foot co-wrote under the pseudonym Cato, but again suggesting that Foot is now the appeaser of the Soviet Union. Very interesting to be reminded that there is a kind of a right-wing Thatcherite street culture, some of whose culture warriors have been governing us for the last 13 years. But really kind of evocative in sort of bringing back memories of Foot. Serendipity. One of the things that Ron collects, which is fascinating, is stuff moving from Masonic groups into the occult. Here is, I don't know what you call this, a meeting card for the Jamrud Lodge, Masonic Lodge, in Peshawar, on the northwest frontier of India, in 1935. I thought, wow, that is really interesting. And then I glanced down at the names of the lodge members, and to my astonishment, I found one G.E. Lennox Boyd. I wrote a biography of Alan Lennox Boyd, George's brother. George died in the Second World War. If you ever go to Christ Church in Oxford, you will see 3 Lennox Boyd brothers listed one after another, George, Francis and Donald, in a sort of Saving Private Ryan type tragedy. But I had no idea of George's. I knew very little about George, certainly not Masonic links. Serendipity, you see. And the great thing about Ron is that he draws this together. He's worthy of the links. And there's this fantastic essay by Ron, I'm assuming it's sort of mid-80s, unpublished, undated, called The Occult and the Beginnings of Modern Socialism. Really making very interesting connections, which have been taken up by much more mainstream academics in recent years, trying to get away from this idea that there's a dichotomy between the occult and the esoteric and, if you like, rationalism and science and rational forms of politics, looking at the interconnections between the two. And I think that, given that this is an essay from the 1980s, it's really kind of quite pioneering and really interesting. So that just gives you a little sense of why I think this is a fantastically exciting collection.
Thank you, Philip. Thank you. And we need to now change slides.
Well, I think it's an...
Oh, my goodness. Amy, over to you.
Thanks. So I'm Amy, and I have kind of been involved in all sorts of kind of projects over the past 6 or 7 years since I last worked at the Institute of Historical Research and used the Heisler collection. So I'm going to kind of talk about how that started, how I was introduced, and then how that work has kind of informed my work up to today and how I still use the Heisler collection. So I was introduced to the collection through Layla Kasser, who's a librarian at Senate House, who's in the audience, because we worked on the Layers of London project, which, for those of you who don't know, was a kind of digital mapping project across London. The idea is that you can digitise stories, collections, and under-recorded stories can be represented on this map and be made freely accessible. Layla found this amazing piece by the Rights of Women group, Feminist History in the East End, which was a kind of fundraising effort, but also researching women's history in a way that hadn't been done before, especially working class women's history. So we worked together with some students as well to digitise it and put it on this map. Once introduced to this, though, as you mentioned, Philip, that I then learned a bit about, I got time with the collection and found all of these amazing bits and materials. There was writing from like mums groups in Bristol where they'd get together and write poetry, lots of working class voices, and a way that like I'd never seen class defined before, really intersectional in a way that I thought was quite new, but was happening in the 70s and in the 80s. And so I was really fascinated by the breadth of these collections, and knew that I wanted to do something with the Federation of Worker Writers and Community Publishers, whose work kept coming up in the collection, but I wasn't sure what I was going to do. And I was living in Peckham at the time, and then kind of serendipity again. I went to the South London Gallery, and they happened to have an exhibition on about the book place, which is where the Peckham Publishing Project ran from. And it reminded me of the amazing collection, and I thought that's what I will focus my master's on. So this is an example of some of the material there. So this was from this, I Want to Write It Down, Writing by Women in Peckham group. They collectively wrote this poem addressed to Margaret Thatcher. And quite a lot of the work is digitised online. And so really emotive stuff. And there was migration stories and histories in there. There was, accounts of difficult relationships that women had had with the trade union. Here's the chick strikers. And there were community campaigns, so local activism, especially around nursery education cuts and things like that. A big part of their work was about making sure that there was diverse images in the schools and things like that. So the book place would go to schools, very similar to the work of Centerprise and things like that. But Peckham hadn't really had the research that it deserved. And then from then on, looking at kind of political material, I ended up getting a job at Newington Green Meeting House. Obviously, you had lots of people associated with Newington Green Meeting House, most famously Mary Wollstonecraft and Richard Price, who was a kind of radical preacher. And then I used this idea of sharing political information historically, as inspired by the Heisler collection, to kind of engage people with feminisms today. So this was some work where we created zines and we shared political information inspired by that radical culture from 300 years ago, but also more recently. We ended up creating our own zine based on that, which was very much based on the work from the Heisler collection. And so it got me interested in all of these different topics. We actually spoke about Enzine at the Spinous Wonders event that Senate House Library did last year. And now then that brought me to all of those areas of interest, brought me to applying to a PhD at the University of Manchester with the People's History Museum on Red Rag, which I started very recently. But that kind of ephemera and material, so Red Rag published quite a few pamphlets, and I came across them in the Heisler collection. And then seeing what events they're going to, because there's a flyer there, and what order these things are in the collection. So, for example, the Hilary Wainwright papers, which are at the People's History Museum, being able to see where she was going and what she was doing at the time alongside that research. These are just some pictures of the Red Rag publication, which is also in the Heisler collection. This is a nice comic. I think it says something along the lines of what's the difference between that your husband's at a political meeting and your husband's at the pub. And as you can see, there isn't really much difference. And this is how they kind of self-depicted in volume 6 of the kind of work that they were doing in the kind of environments that they were working in, and then kind of making that link to work that's being today. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Amy. Thank you. So we've addressed some of the important broader issues around the nature of political archiving, and we'll come back to some of those shortly. We've gone via thinking about the occult, but also pulling out some of the material, but also the ways in which the Heisler collection serves as an inspiration for other archive practices. I now want to turn to Ron and to ask Ron to really take us into your head, really. Like, why did you start collecting? And for you, what is the value of this collection?
Well, to start off with, a friend of mine called Robin Jameson, who was the stepson of a notable Trotskyist called Sam Bornstein, was a friend of mine at school, Northwold School in Hackney, and I used to go home with him for an hour or so. Mm-hmm. And this was when I was about 11, 12. And so I began to hear about a political movement. And then when I was 15 or 16, Robin Jameson said, well, would you like to join the Young Socialists when we set it up in Hackney Central Labour Party, you see? So it started off in that way. And so that was an accident. That was the sort of serendipity of life, you know. Accidents in my book are very, very important. So that developed to a degree, and Hackney Central Young Socialist was the most important Labour Party Young Socialist for several years in the whole of London. We had AGMs with an attendance of 60 people on occasion. There was an attempt by an organisation called the Socialist Labour League to take it over one AGM when they sent in, I think it was 30 or 40 people who tried to take over the AGM. But I pointed out, correctly of course, that they hadn't been registered as members, which was a little oversight on their part. But despite the fact that there was a bit of, how shall we say, bodily resistance to their attempt, they retired from the scene defeated morally. I'm not going to say physically. Anyway, then when I went to the Regent Street Polytechnic, there was a wonderful teacher teaching us British Constitution and history. I forget his name, but he was a noted historian of railway trade unions. And he came from the Isle of Wight, where his father had been a famous conscientious objector going back to the beginning of the century. And this man imparted a Christian socialist attitude, actually, to people whom he made the subjects of British Constitution and government interesting for A-level, and he got good results. Then a few years later, after I'd left the LSE, I went to work for the Middlesex Polytechnic a few years later. And at the Middlesex Polytechnic, I taught for 4 years on the Diploma in Industrial Relations, which had been set up by Jimmy Carruthers. Perhaps one or two people may remember his name. Jimmy Carruthers set this up, and it was a diploma for people who had no qualifications at all to study in an academic environment. At that time, the Labour government had provided funds for such people to get grants and so on. And we were getting 20, 30, 40 people at the peak in a particular year. to study on this course. And the one thing that stood out for me, as the best memory was, the high percentage of people who would suddenly say to me, you know, I read E.P. Thompson's Making of the English Working Class. Again and again it came out when you had long conversations with people. You didn't mention that book. They mentioned it. That was the inspiring book. And I would say, to be a little bit literary, some people, a lot of people may recognise the allusion. Was this E.P. Thompson's Making of the English Working Class? Was this the book? Was this the pen that launched 1,000 PhDs? And the answer is probably yes. It was a book which was translated in several foreign languages and had equal influence in Germany and France. The point about it is the eclecticism, which some people will see is a problem with my approach, is very, very clear in Thompson's book. He covers so many areas, in many of which he was a pioneer, and he links them all in. He's saying all these radical movements going back to the 17th century are feeding into their successors. They may fail in their own time, but some people who, from that moment in time, some people pass something on to the next generation, and that's how it's proceeded. So that was an inspiration and influenced my attitude. Maybe is my 5 minutes up?
No, you've still got. But I'm going to ask you.
More anyway.
I'm going to ask you if I can take you into the archive, because what is your own personal favourite piece? That's what I'd like to know, because as you say, there is so much in the archive. It's beautifully eclectic.
You gave me prior notice. You gave me prior notice. And there's about 5 things I'd like to mention, just to show the diversity of things. I brought down at Dalston Waste on one occasion, maybe 20 years ago, from Norman Palmer, who's immortalised in a certain book on Hackney, many people will have read, by a certain occasional novelist whose name I can't even remember at the moment. Yes, that's right, yes. It was a collection of 7 pamphlets issued over 10 years by Robert Owen between 1836 and 1846, 1836 and 1846, which were parts intended to make a complete book. And the parts were bound together. And it was part of a group of other books which cost me £10. Whether it was the pamphlets that pleased me or the price, I don't know. Then there is something else which hasn't surfaced as yet in the cataloguing, but will one day, of course. Dread, D-R-E-D, is E-A-D, was the second novel of Harriet Beecher Stowe. It's, unlike Uncle Tom's Cabin, it's a failure as a novel. But I found on a market stall a large broadsheet called Dread. It turned out it was obviously a pirate publication in which they'd taken a story, I think, from the novel, reduced it to, the equivalent of maybe 1,000 words. And I'm sure it's actually a unique London publication that I'm pretty sure there's no other copy that exists. So that'll be a great find for specialists in this area one day. I think Richard Temple is somewhere around, our archivist, and he will know the big thing on the post of a strike of 1873, this large thing, not perfect condition, quite large, which either published as a poster to be stuck on walls in the first place, or else by some sort of opportunist publisher of some sort or another, a very small publisher. But it's about the post office strike of 1873. It has illustrations. I'm not saying they're greatly well drawn, and a text which explains the strike. And I'm sure that again is a unique item. Fourthly, I would refer to a friend of who some of people here may remember with some affection or otherwise, Michel Prigent, the situationist. And I had a correspondence with him which has been catalogued by Richard Temple in the archive, about 18 or 20 letters. And he describes in one of the letters how many years ago, when he tried to revise a translation of the veritable split in the Situation Internationalist, he had a row in a house with two members of the Situationist executive at that time in England. And they wanted him not to improve the translation. And at one stage, these leading situationists threatened to ring up the police to get him cleared out of the house, which I thought was a story which is tells us about the frailties of human conviction and principles. And my final case is of a similar sort. Ian Harrison, a former member of the Workers' Revolutionary Party, who was engaged in writing a history which will be, I'm sure, will be the definitive history of the Workers' Revolutionary Party and all around it. He wrote me a letter on one occasion, which is in the collection, in which he talks about poetry in the Workers' Revolutionary Party. By the way, this is the party which was supported by Vanessa Redgrave and her brother Corin Redgraves, a great actress and a good actor. And now wait for it. It is about poetry in the Workers' Revolutionary Party. They had a policy of banning the reading of bourgeois poetry on the grounds that it was corrupting to revolutionary socialists. Nevertheless, there was a Palestinian affiliation they had, and they organized, or the executive organized, a public meeting at which poetry was read by the members, by various people from Palestine, including one or two noted poets. But all the other members of the Workers' Revolutionary Party were banned from attending this meeting in case they'd be corrupt. Well, I don't know how you feel about this, but it's the sort of story that has to be preserved.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you so much. And I think you've there given a really lovely sense of the range and scale of the collection. I want to now just sort of think about some of the issues that have emerged from the different perspectives that you've each taken on political archiving. And I want to go back to Keith's point early on about this, so almost kind of if people are now archiving, if communities are now archiving their own material, I mean, Florence, you spoke about coming across this individual archive in somebody's house, and Amy, you've been doing your own kind of archiving work as well with communities. Where does that leave the archive if the archive is everywhere? Keith?
Yeah, it's a real challenge, isn't it? And I think the big problems now as well are kind of organisation and space. and ownership, which I keep going back to, because one of the things I've been recently involved with, and Florence might be aware, is the preservation of the National Union of Mine Workers Archives, which were based in Barnsley in the Yorkshire NUM offices. The Yorkshire Miners Association records were there going back to the 19th century, and then the Yorkshire area of the NUM and the NUM National Records. Literally, there was like water coming into the roof and damaging those archives. So there was a big debate about what is to be done with the archive. Some within the National Union of Mine Workers wanted to keep the archive in Barnsley and keep it in the coalfields, but they couldn't get financial support for that. So luckily, it's now moving to the Modern Records Centre, University of Warwick. But I think, again, that raises the question about ownership and accessibility, because there's a big kind of push within these community heritage organisations for those archives to be available to community researchers. So if you take the NUM one as an example now, that archive is no longer in the coalfield, so it's really only academic historians and others that will be able to access them. So I think that's a real problem for accessibility, given that there's a kind of willingness and a desire for radical organisations, communities, occupational groups to preserve their own history. So I think that's one of the challenges. And what that means for us as professional historians, we're academic historians.
Thank you, Keith. Any other thoughts on that question? What's happening to the archive that you were looking at, that personal archive? What's happening to it?
It's interesting. So a few women, they're kind of holding on to their papers. One woman, actually, our first interviewee for the project, she said, "Why don't you just keep these?" So then there's a question in our mind, now that the project has, the book that we've written has just come out, what do we do with this collection that she gave to us? So I think we need to think now about whether there's somewhere where it can go, or if she would, if her family would like it back. I think it raises a lot of questions.
And I think on that as well, Claire, spoke about this earlier as well, Claire, really is about, and in the collection of Ron's here, that, archives also are a repository for individual and collective emotions. So, one of the things, talking about you find these kind of lodestones within the archives, we found in the Coal project I was working on, was the last minute book for a North Wales NUM lodge. Now, the archives had the lodge minute book from the 1890s all the way through to the 1980s. But this last volume, again, turned up in someone's garage. Someone contacted me via a Facebook group. So now I have that. And again, what's in that? Because what that documents is the final closure of the colliery. And you feel the emotions of the impact that closure had coming through. So I think that's interesting as well, rather than looking at these archives and documents just as printed material, it's the kind of emotions in them as well, and people's lives. Just one other, which I think was, which illustrates this as well. When I was working on the impact of soul music on the Industrialised Communities project, somebody came forward who'd been a teenager in the 1960s, and she'd kept meticulous diaries from around 1968 through to the early 1970s of some of the nightclubs that she'd attended. And that was just an amazing insight into her experiences. And it was all kind of tiny, right? It's difficult to read and stuff, multiple volumes. But again, what comes through is the emotion, the escape, the excitement, and the adrenaline. So she talked about what music was being played, who she met, gatherings with friends in her bedrooms, listening to these same records. So I think it's that as well, it's you. And I know there's a kind of wide corpus now of kind of emotions history, but I think looking at the archives with that as well, with that insight about people's emotions, and again, ownership and accessibility and what we do with it.
And a part of emotions in terms of, Florence, you mentioned that attention to the commitments, the political commitments which are themselves have an emotional dimension. Philip?
No, I was just going to say that the problem is that preserving archives and making them available is an expensive business. To do it properly, to catalogue a collection, to make sure you've got the staff, to make it available, 5 days a week, to guarantee that it's going to be preserved for decades to come. You know, I mean, sparing Richard's blushes, I've found that, you know, over the decades, that if you want to make an archivist cry, tell them that you've got a brilliant collection of 100 boxes of material that someone wants to donate to them, and then immediately say, where are we going to find the money to catalogue this, store it? You know, even some of the, you know, the big repositories, you know, have got major collections that they still haven't got the funds to catalogue properly and therefore make it available. And that's why you've got these, you know, these big players like the, you know, the Warwick Modern Records Centre, because actually there are economies of scale in making these papers available.
And Amy, you've done, I mean, you've worked as a public historian. Do you feel this kind of thirst that people have for recording and for collecting in the same way that Ron's been collecting all these years?
Yeah, I think a lot of communities, you know, don't use the words perhaps archive themselves, but they are doing it every day. So recently I worked in Liverpool on a National Lottery Heritage Fund project, looking at kind of lesser known music histories with young people in the region. And Quadrant Park was where kind of Cream and that nightclub raves cultures kind of started. And, you know, there was we went there with one of the DJs, Mike Nola, who was there, and one of their kind of premier DJs, and he was telling us all about it. The site is a tip now, like an actual tip. That's what it's used for. But he took us there, and it was really interesting. And then there was conversations of, should we archive it? And it's like, well, there's the Facebook group with thousands of people on it. They're doing that every day. And, you know, although you might want to kind of support them, you know, and it's where's that line between taking over and supporting them, and also just starting off the conversation with, well, what do you need and what support do you need, rather than bowling in and assuming that you know what this group need and how to share their memories, because also they might want to share and preserve those memories in a specific way. You might want to make a book out of it, but that might not be of interest to them. They might want to have a festival once a year or something like that instead. Yeah.
Thank you, Amy. Ron, I'm wondering about your feelings about donating your material.
About?
Yeah, your feelings about actually giving the material away, essentially, donating it to an
Well, there was a storage problem in my home. Sorry to give that secret away. But I realised after maybe about 10 years of collecting seriously, which would have been from perhaps when I was about 30, those 10 years from 30 to 40, that one had to have a clearer direction. And I realised, well, the direction is to create a useful collection which is strong enough to merit going into an institution. And so I was thinking about that aspect from when I was about 40. That I thought this would be useful because I was working at the General and Municipal Workers in the research department about 1965 or 66. And there was an elderly lady who was doing a job of going around the various trade unions, cataloguing their early archives, or getting them to catalogue for the first time. It was something to do with what is the great Ruskin College Labour History Bulletin, which was the first of its sort. What is
History Workshop. Yeah.
History Workshop, yes. And she was connected with that group, and I think she's quite well known. She was quite well known in her time. Of course, she'd be over 100, 120 now, if she was like. And I was quite impressed by this lady. But that was the first time, about 1965, that I thought about this problem of archiving and how archives were treated. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm now going to move on to ask you about the question of silence. Silences and absences in the archive. And I want to start with you, Ron.
Weaknesses, you mean? Weaknesses.
Well, no, not weaknesses, just absences or things, the stuff that doesn't get archived. Is there anything that you can think of that you would want in your collection that isn't there? And then I'll ask the others around this.
Well, there are certain areas where we're weak. This is how in the collection. We're very weak on original suffragette material. It's very expensive now, incredibly expensive. You don't know the damage that's been done by Elizabeth Crawford to the market. She's pushed up prices over the years. Whereas with modern feminism, say post-war feminism, we're quite strong, and possibly there may be 700 pamphlets to do with the women's movement in its various manifestations already catalogued. And a few months ago, at least 400 pamphlets would have gone to St. House, which would have added to that, you see. There are certain little organisations I've read about, but have never come across an example of. Has anyone ever heard of the New Era Society, which was going from about 1920 last to the 1950s, which was aimed at some sort of educational project allied to socialism, in which Florence Barnard, who was the cousin of Conrad Noel, was involved in writing up stories and so on. Never seen a copy of any of their activities, of their publications, and yet they had a continuous journal. They published a number of books which were aimed at, obviously, young people. That's an example of the sort of thing. There's always organisations which will suddenly turn up, and then you say, my God, how did I miss it? Even with the woodcraft folk, and the woodcraft folk are fairly well known. Do you know, I have less than 10 items I've found over the years. And the man who really spawned it, John Hargrave, is quite interesting in his own right, both as a social credit man, a left-winger, or leftist rather, who founded the Green Shirts, ended up as a Labour candidate in 1950, but he started off with a publication called The Nomad. And the only copies you'll find on the Interlibrary Hub are in my collection.
Wow, that's thank you. I want to ask Philip about this question because being, your role within history and policy, you're very attuned to that, what gets in a political archive and what doesn't. And I'm wondering about the absences and silences of political archiving in an age of WhatsApp, whereas we know sometimes we get access to the messages and sometimes we don't. Do you have thoughts on how the future of political archiving is going to go?
Well, it's a nightmare. It's a nightmare. And I think Whitehall knows this, and they claim to have protocols in place. But, you've seen from recent inquiries how much material is on things like WhatsApp. So it's not just that this material is often not being properly archived. It's that the old distinction between the official and the private is sort of completely goes out of the window. And it's probably, it's true in many different walks of life. I suppose when I moved here as director of the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, I imagined that there'd be, this mail every day would come in, which I would file somewhere, and maybe someone would help me file it. No, it all just goes into my, what is effectively a private, email address. And you know, it creates nightmares, and you know, we're all still grappling with this as historians. I mean, the other problem, I suppose, for contemporary historians is freedom of information. That, you know, you go back to the 1950s, 1960s, and official records, and you have officials really sort of thinking out loud on minute sheets, in the firm belief, you know, then that whatever they said would probably be closed for at least 50 years. Now there is freedom of information, there is a 20-year rule, and one fears that even on officially, you know, approved files of various sorts, be they, you know, physical or virtual, people will be reluctant to put down anything vaguely interesting and personal and thoughtful, for the fear that it will come round and bite them, you know, in a very short period of time. So I think that, you know, there are all sorts of worries about the quality of the records that we're leaving behind, and not just their sort of material existence.
Thanks, Philip. And other perspectives on this question of absence and silence. I mean, Florence, you then went out and created an archive by doing 100 interviews.
Yeah, and I suppose one of the obvious reasons that we wanted to do those interviews was because even though there are some collections of brilliant interviews, oral history interviews that have been done by other people, going right back actually to Hal Francis, who did some really soon after the end of the strike, and they're archived mainly at the University of Swansea, we still felt that women's voices are underrepresented in the archive of the left, but also that probably women who were involved in a very kind of, at the sort of lowest, most quotidian levels of day-to-day activism were less well represented than those women who, for example, were experienced activists before the start of the miners' strike, and then during the strike might have got involved as a delegate to the National Women Against Trade Union, National Women Against Pit Closures movement, women who had experience in the trade union movement and who were able to use that experience to create records and then create an archive that documented what they did. Women who, for example, were au fait with the practice of chairing a meeting and taking minutes. So we wanted to try and get to the experience of women who got involved in activism during the strike from a position of much less experience, and who were doing things in a much more ad hoc way, and who were not drawing on those skills, which mainly came from the trade union movement, sometimes from other places. Some women had been involved in CND, for example, or something like that. But we wanted to find those women's experiences, and we thought that probably interviewing was really the only way to do it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, similar to what Florence just said, really. I think one of the problems with, I guess, what we call the conventional archives or the national level archives in terms of political organisations and trade unions, that often they're used to kind of retell the heroic stories that have already been told. And the miners' strike is the ultimate example of that. You know, it becomes, you know, if you look at reactions to the miners' strike in '84, it was far more contested, it was far more conflicted, both within mining communities but outside. But in the kind of popular memory now, it is the great strike. It's the heroic struggle. So I think, and that kind of speaks to the absences as well, because what we found in the project we did on the coal industry was that a lot of those absences and silences can actually be found in community Facebook groups. Facebook was an amazing access into these kind of local mining organisations. And what that brings out that doesn't necessarily come out in national minute books and also area minute books is that, you know, the history is messy, it's nuanced, and it's complex. And I think that's a big question as well, particularly, you know, I can broaden this out to my own field, Labour history. I mean, Labour history, you know, for many years was in the doldrums for these very reasons, because it was just kind of regurgitating the heroic narratives with clearly demarked heroes and villains. A lot of work been, you know, great work being done since then. But I think, yeah, it's kind of Lawrence's point, really. I think as historians, one thing we've got to do is to magnify the absences and the silences within the existing archives, and then obviously we've got to dig further to release these voices and release these experiences.
I'm
going to give the last word to Ron, and then we're going to have questions.
I
Ron.
can volunteer one silence, which comes out partly out of my research. I'm not a Freemason, but I find them as fascinating as most people do. Are they villains? Are they decent people? Are they a mix? Are they, do they reflect the population in general in the lower middle classes that make up most of Freemasonry? No one has actually done a proper book on Freemasonry and the trade union movement. Yet I've got a list somewhere which I took from some Labour directories about 1920, 24, and found dozens of names of trade unions who listed, leading trade unions who were listed as Freemasons. I also have over the years found other names of trade unions, trade unionists who were Freemasons. There's the Parliamentary Welcome Lodge, which was set up by the Labour Party members because they could not get into, they were keen to get involved in Masonic lodges. And George and the Prince of Wales, who I think was the Grand Master, who became Edward VIII briefly, thought it would be a good idea if a lodge was set up for these MPs. And to this lodge was also added various leading trade unionists who happened to be working in that around Westminster. So it's convenient for them to go to this lodge, which took place in Westminster somewhere. So anyway, a history of trade unionism in connection with Freemasonry, it would turn out to be quite surprising. And it would have to involve, of course, an assessment of what was the influence on the political evolution of trade unionism.
Thank you, Ron. It's surprising. History is surprising. It's complex. It's nuanced. It's messy. And on that note, I'm now going to open it up to questions. And I believe somebody's going to take this microphone and deploy it. And I'm going to move up there. So formulate your questions. And if you have one, could you raise your hand, please? I'm going to take that one there.
Is it me? Hello, my name's John Goodman, a self-curating collector of mine and my father's collection on its way to the Modern Records Centre. But more to the point, I'm one of the 4 participants who are running the Radical Bookselling History project. One of my colleagues is Dave Cope, who I think has supplied some of your material, Ron.
Yes, it's cost me quite a lot.
Yeah, he's a good businessman. So we've been running this project for the last 4 years as a kind of part of the broader political economy of radical publications. And we're doing oral histories, and we're trying to find the archives, the records in people's cellars and their basements. But my question is about local collections, because one of the things we're doing, and one of the things I've done, is deposit material at local collections. And they're very variable. They're even poorer than the national collections. We think it's important from the point of view of accessibility and part of the local stories, all politics is local, to encourage local archivists, county records office, to treat this kind of material seriously. We're finding it very difficult. I'm wondering if you've got any thoughts on that and advice.
Does anybody have any thoughts on this and how we can encourage and support local collections?
it's something that I've encountered. I don't know if Florence did, but the Flintshire Record Office, which I'm most familiar with, just haven't got the space now to take some collections. And I'm sure, obviously, cuts within council budgets and things. So this problem of space is always going to be an issue.
Then we will move on to the next question. Thank you. We had one there, and then we'll come here. So if we can take that question there.
Hello. Yes. I mean, I know Ron primarily through bumping into him in the first instance in assorted second-hand bookshops across London. From the one that used to be under Housemans, run by Barry and Andrew, maybe one of them's here, where Ron used to have a little special, you realised there were Rons that had his own books within the for sale with a little, and you could work out who they were because they always had a little RH, I think. I think that's right, isn't it, Ron? Yeah?
Yes.
Scrawled in the margins. My question, however, is I just feel so warm about the fact that Ron's collection is here. And if I wanted to access it, I could. So firstly, that's a point of appreciation. The question is, because I have my own overflowing basement, which is not going down well with my wife, I tell you that. And Ron, and I'm like Ron, I mean, he once muttered to me when he bumped into me in an Oxfam shop, another addict, which is very true. And can the collection be added to by other people, is my question.
That's a question for you, Ron, then.
Of course it can be, but please make sure that what's being added is interesting in its own right.
Okay. Keep the interest going. We had a question at the front.
Thank you. I am Mohammed Bermadani, and I live in the Socialist Republic of Camden Town. Recently, a distinguished scholar called Philip Bagwell, now is an expert in trade unions, and I am lucky I got his private collection by chance. It's not my field. My subject is Middle East and North African geopolitics. But I have got his collection, amazing collection. And all collectors, like the gentleman and myself, I have 30,000 volumes on Middle East and North Africa in my place. And I have a problem. Plus my personal archives. So, plus press cutting and so on. Now, recently during King's Cross renovation, there was a project, I took part in it, on recording oral history, local history around King's Cross. And it was also broadcast on Radio 4. And there are two copies, one in the British Library and one in Islington Library, public library. What was interesting in this project, oral history, local oral history, is that basically how it is changed, how Labour Party members during the elections time, the family get together, have lunch, and all go to vote Labour Party. And if one of the member of the family vote for another party, he's automatically excluded from the family. So I found that quite interesting. And on Robert Murdoch revolt, I was working in the Times at the time when he bought it over. And I was just a part-time. I was working in the foreign desk. We were doing one page a week on foreign affairs. and I worked with a distinguished journalist called Robert Edward Mortimer, a foreign editor. So Murdoch came in, he said, basically to the journalists, I wasn't part of the full-time, mainly the main editors, he wanted Thatcher tabloid. And all that kind of serious journalism, he doesn't want it. So I gave up my job. Robert Mortimer left, and we know the result. So that's how it is. But I think oral history, archives, special archives, it's very hard to find a space for them and how to find the money, as our friend said, how to do them. I offered my personal archives to Morocco National Archives. But they have to be, if you offer your archives, you have to be careful what you have to negotiate, because they might take what they want and they will throw the other things, especially if they are political archive material. So this is what I want to suggest to say.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Any response? I mean, the question of how to archive interviews is a key one, isn't it?
And I suppose you need an archive that is able to deal with the potential problems with formats as well there.
Yeah.
So there's the question of resources and making sure you have the resources to maintain the records and make them available, indefinitely. But also when you have interviews, you have the specific problem that even though it sort of seems now to us kind of unthinkable that it might become difficult to play an audio file in a particular of a particular type, actually the recent past does suggest to us that that is not the case, and that things that seem totally normal to us and not a problem at all become obsolete quicker than you would ever imagine. Some of the interviews that I've listened to from archives for the Women in the Miners' Strike project, they were still on tapes. And some of them I actually digitized myself. I got a little machine where you can digitize material from tapes, because I thought that would be, because with tapes, even playing them over time degrades them, which is a whole other issue. That's not even about whether you have the technology to play them. So yeah, with interviews or video material, actually in a way with any kind of material that's created, born digital as well, it becomes an issue. It's hard to imagine that it could be difficult to open a Word document at any point in the future, but these things do happen. A student of mine was trying to get a Betamax player to look at some stuff in an archive, and it just proved actually financially impossible to do that. So there's a whole load of issues with archiving interviews that are really challenging.
Thank you, Florence. Thank you. And I think thinking about the challenge of the future might be a good place for us to bring this discussion to a close, because I think the reception is all set up in the back. And so I'm going to now hand back to Andrew.
Yes, I just want to say a few words of thank you by way of concluding the evening. A very, very big thank you to our panel participants, to Keith, Amy, Florence, Philip, and of course to Ron. A wonderful thank you to Claire for not only chairing this evening's panel, but organising it. Thanks very much to my colleagues in Senate House Library and to the University of London Development Office for choreographing the evening so wonderfully. And if I may be allowed to just say one more thing before we depart, which is to encourage those of you who are not signed up as friends of Senate House Library to take the opportunity to do so. You can find out how to do so on the University of London website, or you can speak to any of my colleagues on the registration desk and they will be able to sign you up today. And you can do so for free. Before I invite you and everyone to participate in the reception, can I please ask you to join me in thanking the panel and Claire once again for a wonderful discussion, for sharing their thoughts and experiences on archives in such an engaging way. So thank you very much.